Chapter 2. Let us now praise. For most of this century, U.S. foreign policy has been devoted to the suppression of revolutionary governments and radical movements around the world. The turn of the 20th century found the McKinley administration in a war of attrition against the people of the Philippines lasting from 1898 to 1902, with pockets of resistance continuing for years after. In that conflict, U.S. forces slaughtered some 200,000 Filipino women, men, and children. At about the same time, in conjunction with various European colonial powers, the U.S. invaded China to help suppress the Boxer Rebellion at substantial loss of life to the Chinese rebels. U.S. forces took over Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. In the following decades, invaded Mexico, Soviet Union, Nicaragua, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic and other countries, actions that usually inflicted serious losses upon the populations of these countries. The costs of counter-revolution. From grade school through grad school, few of us are taught anything about these events except to be told the U.S. forces must intervene in this or that country in order to protect U.S. interests, thwart aggression, and defend our national security. U.S. leaders fashioned other convenient rationales for their interventions abroad. The public was told that the peoples of various countries were in need of our civilizing guidance. Oh my god. That is so fucked. And desired the blessings of democracy, peace, and prosperity. To accomplish this, of course, it might be necessary to kill off considerable numbers of the more recalcitrant among them. Such were the measures of our policymakers were willing to pursue in order to uplift lesser peoples. The emergence of major communist powers like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China lent another dimension to U.S. global counter-revolutionary policy. Communists were depicted as evil incarnate, demonized conspirators who sought power for power's sake. The U.S. had to be everywhere to counteract the spreading cancer, we're told. In the name of democracy, U.S. leaders waged a merciless war against revolutionaries in Indochina for the better part of 20 years. They dropped many times more tons of explosives on Vietnam than they were used throughout World War II by all combatants combined. Testifying before a congressional committee, former CIA Director William Colby admitted, under his direction, U.S. forces and their South Vietnam collaborators carried out the selective assassination of 24,000 Vietnamese dissidents in what was known as the Phoenix Program. His associate, the South Vietnamese Minister of Information, maintained that 40,000 was a more accurate estimate. U.S. policymakers and their media mouthpieces judged the war a mistake because the Vietnamese proved incapable of being properly instructed by B-52 bomber raids and death squads. By prevailing against this onslaught, the Vietnamese supposedly demonstrated that they were unprepared for our democratic institutions. Alright. In pursuit of counter-revolution, and in the name of freedom, U.S. forces and U.S.-supported surrogate forces slaughtered 2 million North Koreans in a 3-year war. 3 million Vietnamese. Over 500,000 in aerial wars over Laos and Cambodia. Over 1.5 million in Angola. Over 1 million in Mozambique. Over 500,000 in Afghanistan. 5,000 to 1 million in Indonesia. 200,000 in East Timor. 100,000 in Nicaragua, combining the Somoza and Reagan eras. Over 100,000 in Guatemala, plus an additional 40,000 disappeared. Over 700,000 in Iraq. Over 60,000 in El Salvador. 30,000 in the dirty war of Argentina, though the government admits to only 9,000. 35,000 in Taiwan when the Kuomintang military arrived from China. 20,000 in Chile, and many thousands in Haiti, Panama, Grenada, Brazil, South Africa, Western Sahara, Zaire, Turkey, and dozens of other countries, in what amounts to be a free market world holocaust. Official sources either deny these U.S.-sponsored mass murders or justify them as necessary measures had to be taken against an implacable communist foe. Anti-communist propaganda saturated our airwaves, schools, and political discourse. Despite repeated, often fictitious references to the tyranny of the Red Menace, the anti-communist opinion makers never spelled out what communists actually did in the way of socio-economic policy. This might explain why, despite decades of red-bashing propaganda, most Americans, including many who number themselves among the political cognoscenti, still cannot offer an informed statement about the social policies of communist societies. The anti-red propagandists uttered nary a word about how revolutionaries in Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, Nicaragua, and other countries nationalized the lands held by rich, exploitative landlords and initiated mass programs for education, health, housing, and jobs. Not a word about how their efforts advanced the living standards and life chances of hundreds of millions in countries that had long suffered under the yoke of feudal oppression and Western colonial pillage, an improvement in mass well-being never before witnessed in history. No matter what the revolutionaries in various Asian, African, and Latin American countries enjoyed popular supports, no matter that they did, and were willing to pursue a neutralist course in East-West relations other than place themselves under the hegemony of either Moscow or Peking, they still were targeted for a counter-revolutionary battering. From opposing communists because they might be revolutionaries, it was a short step to opposing revolutionaries because they might be communists. The real sin of revolutionaries, communist or not, was that they championed the laboring classes against the wealthy few. They advocated changes in the distribution of class power and the way wealth was produced and used. They wanted less individualistic advancement at the expense of the many and collective betterment for the entire working populace. Presumptions of power. Ruling classes throughout the world would hate and fear communism not for its lack of political democracy, but because it attempts to establish an economic democracy by building an egalitarian, collectivist social system. Though they rarely come right out and say as much. This counter-revolutionary interventionist policy rests on several dubious assumptions that might be stated and rebutted as follows. 1. U.S. leaders have the right to define the limits of socio-economic development within other nations. Not true. Under no canon of international law or any other legal structure do the leaders of this country have the right to ordain what kind of economic system or mode of social development another country may adopt. No more right than do the leaders of other countries have to dictate such things to the U.S. In practice, the option to dictate is either exercised by the strong over the weak, a policy of might, not right. 2. U.S. must play a counter-revolutionary containment role in order to protect our national interests. This is only true only if we equate our national interests with the investment interests of high finance. U.S. interventionism has been very effective in building neo-imperialism, keeping the land, labor, natural resources, and markets of third-world countries available at bargain prices to multinational corporations. But these corporate interests do not represent the interests of the U.S. people. The public pays for the huge military budgets and endures the export of its jobs to foreign labor markets. The inflow of thousands of impoverished immigrants who compete for scarce employment and housing and various other costs of empire. Furthermore, revolutionary governments like Cuba, Libya, Vietnam, and North Korea were, and still are, eager to trade and maintain peaceful relations with this country. These countries do not threaten the national security of the U.S. or its people, but the overseas interests of global capitalism. If allowed to multiply its numbers, countries with an alternative social system, an alternative socialist system, one that uses the land, labor, capital, and natural resources in collectivist ways, placing people before profits, would eventually undermine global capitalism. Quote, number 3, quote, the U.S. has a moral obligation to guarantee the stability of nations that are undergoing democratic development but are threatened by revolutionaries and terrorists. Most U.S. interventions are on behalf of corrupt and self-serving oligarchs and anti-democratic militarists. Third world oligarchs are frequently educated at elite U.S. universities or end up on the CIA payroll, as do their police chiefs and military officers, many of whom receive training in torture and assassination at U.S. counterinsurgency institutions. U.S. policymakers maintain that they favor eliminating mass poverty in poorer countries, and then they're not opposed to the laudatory objectives of social revolution, but to its violent methods. They say that transformations must be effected gradually and peacefully, preferably through private investment and the benign workings of the free market. In fact, corporate investments more likely to deter rather than encourage reform by preempting markets and restructuring the local economy to fit foreign capital extraction needs. International finance capital has no interest in bettering the life chances of third world peoples. Generally, as Western investments have increased in the Third World, life conditions for the ordinary peasants and workers have grown steadily more desperate. People throughout the world do not need more corporate investments. They need the opportunity to wrest back their land, labor, natural resources, and markets in order to serve their own social needs. Such a revolutionary development invites fierce opposition from apostles of the free market, whose violent resistance to social change makes peaceful transformation impossible to contemplate. Even in countries like the US, where reforms of limited scope have been achieved without revolution, the peaceful means employed have entailed popular struggle and turmoil, and a considerable amount of violence and bloodshed, almost all of it inflicted by police and security forces. The last point frequently goes unmentioned in discussions about the ethics of revolutionary violence. The very concept of revolutionary violence is somewhat false cast, since most of the violence comes from those who attempt to prevent reform, not from those struggling for reform. By focusing on the violent rebellions of the downtrodden, we overlook the much greater repressive force and violence utilized by the ruling oligarchs to maintain the status quo, including armed attacks against peaceful demonstrations, mass arrests, torture, destruction of opposition organizations, suppression of dissident publications, death squad assassinations, the extermination of whole villages, and the like. Most social revolutions begin peaceably. Why would it be otherwise? Who would not prefer to assemble and demonstrate rather than engage in mortal combat against pitiless forces that enjoy every advantage in mobility and firepower? Revolutions in Russia, China, Vietnam, and El Salvador all began peacefully, with crowds of peasants and workers launching non-violent protests only to be met with violent oppression from their authorities. Peaceful protest and reform are exactly what the people are denied by the ruling oligarchs. The dissidents who continue to fight back, who try to defend themselves from the oligarchs' repressive fury, are then called violent revolutionaries and terrorists. Those local and international elites who maintain control over most of the world's wealth, social revolution is an abomination. Whether it be peaceful or violent, it's a question of no great moment to them. Peaceful reforms that infringe upon the profitable accumulations and threaten their class privileges are as unacceptable to them as social upheaval imposed by revolution. Reforms that advance the conditions of life for the general public are not as materially intractable or as dependent on capital resources as we've been led to believe. Hey guys. Hey. There's no great mystery to building a health clinic, carrying out programs for food rationing, land distribution, literacy, jobs, and housing. Such tasks are well within the capacity of any state, if there's a political will and a mobilization of popular class power. Consider Kerala, a state in India where the actions of popular organizations and mass movements have won important victories over the last 40 years against political, economic oppression, generating a level of social development considerably better than that found in most of the Third World, and accomplished without outside investment. Kerala has mass literacy, a lower birth rate, and lower death rate than the rest of India, better public health services, fewer child workers, higher nutritional levels, more enlightened legal support, and educational programs for women, some social security protections for working people, and for the destitute and physically handicapped. In addition, the people of Kerala radically altered a complex and exploitative system of agrarian relations and won important victories against the more horrific forms of caste oppression. Though Kerala has no special sources of wealth, it has had decades of communist organization and political struggle that reached and moved large numbers of people and breathed life into the state's democracy. Despite its relatively short periods in the leadership of government, it's the Communist Party that set the basic legislative agenda of the people of Kerala, notes scholar V.K. Ramachandran. All this is not only to deny that many people in Kerala endure unacceptable conditions of poverty, still, despite a low level of income and limited resources, the achievements wrought by democratic government intervention and propelled the mass action have been substantial, representing the difference between a modestly supportive existence and utter misery. Many third world peoples produced dedicated and capable popular organizations, as did the communists in Kerala, but they're usually destroyed by repressive state forces. In Kerala, popular agitation and input took advantage of democratic openings and in turn gave more social substance to the democracy. What's needed for social betterment is not International Monetary Fund loans or corporate investments, but political organization and democratic opportunity, and freedom from U.S.-sponsored state terrorism. U.S. foreign aid programs offer another example how imperialist policy masquerades as social reform within third world nations. Aid programs are not intended to effect serious social betterment. At best, they finance piecemeal projects of limited impact. More often, they're used to undermine local markets, drive small farmers off their land, build transportation and office facilities needed by outside investors, increase a country's debt and economic dependency, and further open its economic economy to multinational corporate penetration. Free market for the few. Third world revolutionaries are branded as the enemies of stability. Stability is a code word for a society in which privileged social relations are securely entrenched. When popular forces mobilize against privilege and wealth, this causes instability, which is judged to be undesirable by U.S. policymakers and their faithful flacks in the U.S. corporate media. Here we have a deceptive state of affairs. What poses as a U.S. commitment to peaceful, nonviolent change is really a commitment to the violent defense of an unjust, undemocratic global capitalism. The U.S. national security state uses coercion and violence not in support of social reform, but against it. All in the name of stability, counterterrorism, democracy, and of late and more honestly, the free market. Oh, there's a whole bunch of imperial dog whistles. When he was head of the State Department policy planning staff during the early years of the Cold War, noted author George Kennan revealed the ruthless realpolitik mentality of those dedicated to social inequality within and between nations. Kennan maintained that a wealthy U.S. facing an impoverished world could not afford the luxury of altruism and world benefaction, and should cease talking about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. The less we're hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. Speaking in a briefing for U.S. ambassadors to Latin America, Kennan remarked, "The final answer might be an unpleasant one, but we should not hesitate before police repression by the local government. This is not shameful, since communists are essentially traitors. It's better to have a strong, repressive regime in power than a liberal government if it's indulgent, relaxed, and penetrated by communists." In 1949, State Department intelligence officer Kennan wrote that communists were people who are committed to the belief that the government has direct responsibility for the welfare of the people. So they had to be dealt with harshly without regard for such niceties as democratization and human rights. It said that U.S. cannot renege on its commitments to other peoples and must continue as world leader. The rest of the world expects that of us, but the ordinary peoples of the world have never called for U.S. world leadership. Quite contrary, they usually want the U.S. to go home and leave them to their own affairs. This is because U.S. commitments are not to the ordinary people of other lands, but to the privileged reactionary factions that are most accommodating to Western investors. As Kennan's remarks indicate, the U.S. policymaking establishment has been concerned not with the advancing of the welfare of impoverished peoples around the world, but with defeating whoever allies themselves with the common people, be them Reds or nuts, or not. Whatever their grave shortcomings, do not U.S.-supported third world rulers represent something better than the kind of tyranny that communists and revolutionary totalitarians bring? Academic cheerleaders for U.S. interventionism, like Samuel P. Huntington of Harvard University, thinks so. Quote, however bad a given evil may be, a worse one is always possible and often likely. Huntington concludes, going on to defend as lesser evils the murderous regimes in Chile under Pinochet and South Africa under apartheid. You might recall John Kirkpatrick's distinction between benign authoritarian right-wing governments that supposedly are not all that brutal and allow gradual change, and horrid totalitarianism, left-wing ones that suppress everyone. The real distinction is that the right-wing government maintains existing privileged order of the free market, keeping the world safe for the empowered hierarchies and wealthy classes of the world. In contrast, the left-wing totalitarians want to abolish exploitative property relations and create a more egalitarian economic system. They're favoring the have-nots over the haves is what makes them so despicable in the eyes of the latter. U.S. leaders claim to be offended by certain features of social revolutionary governments, such as one-party rule and the coercive implementation of revolutionary change. But one-party autocracy is acceptable if the government is rightist, that is friendly towards private corporate investments, as in Turkey, Zaire, Guatemala, Indonesia, and dozens of other countries, including even communist countries that are sliding down the free market path like China. You might recall that unforgettable moment when President George Bush, whose invasions of Panama and Iraq brought death and destruction to those nations who presided over a U.S. military empire that is the single greatest purveyor of violence in the world, lectured revolutionary leader Nelson Mandela on the virtues of nonviolence, even going so far as to quote Martin Luther King during Mandela's visit. Mandela's real sin in Bush's eyes was that he was part of a revolutionary movement that engaged in armed struggle against a violently repressive apartheid regime in South Africa. Bush's capacity for selective perception had all the unexamined audacity of a dominant ideology that condemns only those who act against an unjust status quo, not those who use violence to preserve it. It would have come as a great relief to people around the world if the President of the U.S. had adopted a policy of nonviolence for his own government. In fact, he'd done no such thing. U.S. political and economic leaders may find revolutionary reforms undesirable, but most people who live in revolutionary societies find them preferable to the old regimes and worth defending. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was a fiasco not because of insufficient air coverage, but because the Cuban people closed ranks behind their government and threw back the invaders. Another captive people, North Vietnamese, acted in similar fashion in the earlier 70s. Instead of treating the severe destruction and disruptions caused by the U.S. aerial war against their country as a golden opportunity to overthrow Hanoi's yoke, they continued to support their beleaguered government at great sacrifice to themselves. In South Vietnam, the National Liberation Front enjoyed tactical opportunities for supply and surprise, largely because it was supported by people in the countryside and cities. During the Vietnam era, explanations as to why people sided with the communist revolutionaries came from some unexpected sources. U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge admitted, "The only people who have been doing anything for the little man to lift him up have been the communists." In a similar vein, one faithful propagator of the official line, columnist James Reston, wrote with surprising candor. Even Premier Key, U.S.-sponsored dictator of South Vietnam, told his reporter today that the communists were closer to the people's yearnings for social justice and an independent life than his own government. What Lodge and Reston left unsaid was that little man and the people's yearnings for social justice were the very things that U.S. leaders were bent on suppressing. When people conclude that anyone who utters a good word about leftist one-party revolutions must harbor anti-democratic or Stalinist sentiments, but to applaud social revolutions is not to oppose political freedom. To the extent that revolutionary governments construct substantive alternatives for their people, they increase human options and freedom. There's no such thing as freedom in the abstract. There is freedom to speak openly and iconoclastically, freedom to organize a political opposition, freedom of opportunity to get an education and pursue a livelihood, freedom to worship as one chooses or not worship at all, freedom to live in healthful conditions, freedom to enjoy various social benefits, and so on. Most of what's called freedom gets its definition within a social context. Revolutionary governments extend a number of popular freedoms without destroying those freedoms that never existed in the previous regimes. They foster conditions necessary for national self-determination, economic betterment, preservation of health and human life, and the end of many of the worst forms of ethnic, patriarchal, and class oppression. Regarding patriarchal oppression, consider the vast improved condition of women in revolutionary Afghanistan, in South Vietnam before the counter-revolutionary repression in the 90s, or in Cuba after the '59 revolution as compared to before. U.S. policymakers argue that social revolutionary victory anywhere represents a diminution of freedom in the world. The assertion is false. The Chinese Revolution did not crush democracy. There was none to crush in that oppressively feudal regime. The Cuban Revolution did not destroy freedom, it destroyed a hateful US-sponsored police state. The Algerian Revolution did not abolish national liberties, precious few existed under French colonialism. The Vietnamese revolutionaries did not abrogate individual rights, no such rights were available under the US-supported puppet government of Bao Dai, Diem, and Qui. Of course, revolutions do limit the freedoms of the corporate property class and other privileged interests, the freedom to invest privately without regard to human and environmental costs, the freedom to live in obscene opulence while paying workers starvation wages, the freedom to treat the state as a private agency in the service of a privileged coterie, the freedom to employ child labor, child prostitutes, the freedom to treat women as chattel, and so on. Today, no one in U.S. policy circles worries about the politico-economic oppression suffered in dozens of right-wing client states. Their professed desire to bring Western political democracy to nations that have had revolutions rarely extends to free market autocracies, and the grudging moves towards political democracy occasionally made in these autocracies come only through popular pressure and rebellion, and only with the unspoken understanding that democratic governance will not infringe substantially upon the interests of the moneyed class. Is the pain of revolution worth the gain? Cost-benefit accounting is a complicated business when applied to social transitions. But have we ever bothered to compare the violence of revolution against the violence that preceded it? Quote, "I do not know how one measures the price of historical victories," said Robert Heilbronner. "I only know that the way in which we ordinarily keep the books of history is wrong. We make no tally of the generations claimed by that combination of economic exploitation and political suppression, so characteristic of the ancient regimes. The hapless victims of flood and famine in the Yangtze Valley of yesterday, the child prostitutes found dead in the back alleys of old Shanghai, the muziks stricken by cold and starvation across the frozen steppes of Russia. What of today? No one is tallying the thousands of nameless victims who succumbed to US-trained torturers in Latin America, the hundreds of villages burned by counterinsurgency forces, the millions who were driven from their ancestral lands and sentenced to permanently stunted and malnourished lives, the millions more who perish in the desperate misery and congestion of shanty slums and internment camps. Their sufferings go unrecorded and not figured into the balance when revolution metes out justice to erstwhile oligarchs and oppressors or commits excesses and abuses of its own. How do we measure the pain of the tens of millions of children throughout the world, many as young as 6 and 7, forced to work 70 hours a week, confined in an ill-lit, poorly ventilated workshops under conditions reminiscent of the most horrific days of the Industrial Revolution? The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, a sweeping multinational free trade act that amounts to a carte blanche for global capitalism, offers no protection for children who are exploited, abused, overworked, and underpaid. During GATT negotiations, leaders of third world countries successfully argued that placing any restrictions on child labor, arguing that children have always worked in their cultures and such traditional practices should be respected. To prohibit child labor would limit the free market and affect severe hardship on those poor families in which a child is often the only wage earner. Even in the long-standing practice of children helping out on farms is acceptable, if it is, assuming they're not overworked and are allowed to go to school. The practice of locking them into a hotbox or factory for 14 hours a day. Furthermore, they may be the only wage earner because adult workers have been laid off in favor of the children, who are infinitely more exploitable and provide bigger profits for prosperous factory owners. Traveling across Cuba in '59, immediately after the overthrow of U.S.-supported right-wing Batista government, a dictatorship, Mike Faulkner witnessed a spectacle of almost unrelieved poverty. The rural population lived in makeshift shacks without minimal sanitation. Malnourished children went barefoot in the dirt and suffered the familiar plague of parasites common to the third world. There were almost no doctors or schools. For much of the year, families that depended solely on the seasonal sugar harvest lived close to starvation. How does that victimization in pre-revolutionary Cuba measure against the much more widely publicized repression that came after the revolution, when Castro's communists executed a few hundred of the previous regime's political assassins and torturers, drove assorted upper-class moneybags into exile and intimidated various other opponents of radical reforms into silence. Today, Cuba is a different place. For all its mistakes and abuses, the Cuban Revolution brought sanitation, schools, health clinics, jobs, housing, and human services to a level not found throughout most of the Third World and in many parts of the First World. Infant mortality in Cuba dropped from 60 per thousand in 1960 to 9.7 in 1991. The life expectancy rose from 55 to 75 in that same period. Smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, typhoid, polio, and numerous other diseases have been wiped out by improved living standards and public health programs. Cuba has enjoyed a level of literacy higher than the U.S. and a life expectancy that compares well with advanced industrial nations. Other peoples beside the Cubans have benefited, as Fidel Castro tells it. The Cuban Revolution sent teachers, doctors, and workers to dozens of third world countries without charging a penny. It shed its own blood fighting colonialism, fighting apartheid and fascism. At one point, we had 25,000 third world students studying on scholarships. We still have many scholarship students from Africa and other countries. In addition, our countries treated more children, 13,000, who were victims of the Chernobyl tragedy than all other countries put together. They don't talk about that. That's why they blockade us. The country with the most teachers per capita of all countries in the world, including developed countries. The country with the most doctors per capita of all countries, one for every 214 inhabitants. The country with the most art instructors per capita of all countries in the world. The country with the most sports instructors in the world. That gives you an idea of the effort involved. A country where life expectancy is more than 75 years. Why are they blockading Cuba? Because no other country has done more for its people. It's the hatred of the ideas that Cuba represents. Cuba's sin in the eyes of global capitalists is not its lack of democracy. Most third world capitalist regimes are far more repressive. Cuba's real sin is that it's tried to develop an alternative to the global capitalist system, an egalitarian socio-economic order that placed corporate property under public ownership, abolished capitalist investors as a class entity, and put people before profits and national independence before IMF servitude. So a conservative think tank like the Heritage Foundation rated Cuba along with Laos, Iraq, and North Korea as countries with the lowest level of economic freedom. Countries with a high level of economic freedom were those that imposed little or no taxes or regulations on business and did without wage protections, price controls, environmental safeguards, and benefits for the poor. Economic freedom is the real concern of conservatives and plutocrats. The freedom to utilize vast sums of money to accumulate still vaster sums regardless of the human and environmental costs. Mass productivity, coupled with elitist distribution, results in more wealth for the few, greater poverty for the many. After 2 centuries of incredible technological development and unprecedented economic expansion, the number of people living in poverty in the capitalist world has grown more quickly than any other demographic cohort. The world's slum population increased at a far greater rate than the total global population. Amazing growth in industrial productivity has been accompanied by increasingly desperate want, misery, and repression. In short, there's a causal link between vast concentrations of wealth and widespread poverty. The next time someone preaches the free market gospel of economic freedom and productivity, we need to ask for whose benefit and whose cost. Those who show concern for the elites overthrown in the whirl of revolution should also keep in mind the hundreds of millions more who are obliterated by economic reactionism. If all rebellions were to be successfully repressed today and forever, free market autocracy's violence against humanity would be with us more unrestrained than ever, as is indeed happening. For these reasons, those of us who are genuinely concerned about democracy, social justice, and the survival of our planet should support rather than oppose these popular revolutions.